everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. I'm Latucci, Mateo here. It's my pleasure to be the host of our speaker today. Today is the annual History of Astronomy Colloquium, and it's our pleasure to have Ivano Dal Prete. Ivano is a senior lecturer in the History of Science and Medicine program at Yale University. He has taught and conducted research at the University of Minnesota, Columbia University, Harvard, in Florence, beautiful, by the way, the Huntington Library in Pasadena, and the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America, Columbia University. Ivano has published extensively on the social and cultural history of modern astronomy, the earth sciences, and science and religion. And his recent monograph on extra-terrestrial overturns the long-held assumption of the 18th century discovery of geological time, showing that actually the notion of ancient Earth was largely acceptable in the pre-enlightened Europe. And he's also working on a new book project on the cultural history of human generation and extraterrestrial life. And it's our pleasure today to have him speak about the moon deluge and other otherworldly catastrophes. Thank
you for your kind presentation. We have only a few little catastrophes here today. And so almost all of them, apart from that, I lost all of the notes that I had in my presenter's view. So I had to use old-fashioned paper. And let me say, first of all, that it is a huge honor for me to be here. I never become a professional astronomer for a lot of very good reasons. But I've been an astronomy nerd since the age of 8 or 9, probably, while at the same time I devoured every book on history that I could put my hands on. And so in the next 10 years or so, I lead a normal life of an amateur astronomer. And if you ever thought that being an astronomy nerd didn't make you particularly popular in the village or in the neighborhood, try being an astronomy history nerd on top of it. And I was both. Yeah, the White Sox probably didn't help on the dating scene. After I told my mom, no, mom, okay, it's enough, I will buy my own clothes. But anyway, in college I discovered that there was a thing called history of science that seemed to bring together my two main infatuations. And it looked really interesting because the discipline seemed to focus increasingly on the wider cultural, social, and even political context of past scientific research. And this seems to have a real explanatory power, nothing wrong in figuring out how Newton went from this theorem to the other one. But there are a lot of things that work in the background of our mind, of our culture, that influence the direction of our research and how we think at it and how we interpret and see our data. And this seemed to be a really interesting new field that I decided to dive into. And I started, of course, with astronomy. And I started by examining planetary observations that were conducted in the early 1700s. And indeed, I realized that the interpretation, or rather the construction, of telescopic images was heavily influenced, indeed, by high-stake controversies on the geological history of the Earth, the origins of humankind, and the reality of lack thereof of the biblical flood that raged at the time. In the last few decades, departments of geology and geophysics have increasingly turned into departments of earth and planetary sciences, and I might consider that Harvard did it much earlier than Yale, like 25 years. But the basic idea that the Earth is understood in relation to its cosmic environment, rather than as an isolated body, is much older than the space age or even Schiaparelli or Ruel, and was not new, not even in the 18th century. So the common assumption from antiquity to about 1600 was that the elements that compose the terrestrial environment derive their motion from the heat and movement of the celestial bodies. So we had the celestial spheres, and on the Earth we had the traditional four elements, the Greek tradition. But what puts really in motion the elements is the heat coming from the star and their movement that is transmitted to the lower world. If this smells of astrology, it's because it is. But we shouldn't think of ancient astrology just as the garbage that is now. As a matter of fact, astrology for a long time was a big part of the natural philosophy, and it was a thing that had a very important cultural function. It kept together the microcosm with the microcosm, the heavens with the earth. So basically, it had this function until gravity took over in the 1700s. And honestly, who could deny the existence of celestial influences? I mean, can you deny that the tides seem to be connected to the motions of the moon and the relative positions of the moon and the sun? Of course not. The way they saw it, starting of course from different assumptions, was that the element of water seems to be particularly sensitive to the action of the moon. And is it a coincidence that a woman's menses has roughly the same period as a lunar month? To them it was not a coincidence. Again, female bodies seem to be particularly sensitive to the action of the moon, and perhaps the aggressivity of males instead is a product of a particular sensitivity of male bodies to the influence of Mars, and so on. And the same was true for the Earth as a whole. So let's say that we are around 1400 or even 1500, and we are university students and in Europe. And what we learned about Earth history and how the Earth evolved and changes was that the emerged land is basically a big supercontinent, Africa, Europe, and Asia, that takes up about 25%, 1/4 of the sphere, which is a decently good hunch. And what happens is that this supercontinent is cyclically renovated by the action of the slowest known celestial motion, that is, the precession of the equinoxes, whose period was estimated at the time in about 36,000 years. It is a little less than 26,000, but again, it's in the ballpark. And so what happened to them was that as the vernal points moved across the ecliptic, they dragged with them the ocean, and the ocean raised on one side and withdrew on the other. So you always had a supercontinent, but not all with the same mountains, with the same rivers, with the same seas, and with the same people. So the Earth was kind of always the same, but it was a kind of a dynamic change that was impelled again by astrological forces. So at the end of the cycle, you still have your supercontinent, more or less the same size, but with different mountains, different rivers, and so on. And of course, you will have petrified seashells or fish on mountains, because it used to be the bottom of the ocean. Now, this is what you could learn in a European university around 1400, mainstream. And maybe this sounds a bit counterintuitive, right? Isn't it the Middle Ages? Sorry. What's this thing with those geological cycles lasting tens of thousands of years? Didn't everyone buy into the creation of the Earth like 55 centuries earlier, and so on? Didn't anyone think that you find fossil fish on mountains because there was flood, in historical times? Well, no. Not so simple. There was, of course, the Christian chronological tradition that tried to establish the creation of the world with 4000 something BCE. But then a literal interpretation of Genesis was just one of many possible solutions. And as long as you admit that there was a creation, it was never a problem to make the Earth as old as you want. And this was mainstream stuff that was taught in universities for centuries without any problem, as long as you keep theology and science, they call it natural philosophy, on two separate tracks. And in the Middle Ages, until the mid-1500s, they could do it very well. Contrary to common perceptions, the idea that you have fossil fish because of Noah's flood was not mainstream at all. And until 1600, I found just a bunch of marginal philosophers, of naturalists thinking so. The mainstream option was, what I just shown, that there was great revolutions in the course of a long period of time, and so we are just stomping on what used to be the seafloor and so on. But those floods really was not a physical event. It was a theological and a moral event, mainly. You didn't need to demonstrate it with physical evidence. Now, the things changed, starting more or less from the mid-1500s, for a lot of reasons, but the most important were pretty historical reasons, really. The Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, the religious radicalization of Europe, and the rise of biblical literalism. The Catholic condemnation of Copernicanism and Galileo's trial are the best known example, but this happened in every field. And so, just think of it. Copernicus publishes his book in 1543, no problem. It takes 73 years for it to be condemned. This is what happened in these 73 years. A situation that was not normal at all until the mid-1500s. And so a situation where you have to justify from a religious point of view your scientific theories, while you didn't have to before. And so during the 1600s, the universal flood of the Bible, which had long been a theological and moral story, tended to solidify into a physical event that must have left imposing traces on the surface of the earth, and that must be proved with physical evidence. Now, the problem, which was not lost at all to many contemporaries, is that if such scientific evidence is not found or proves unconvincing, then you have to abandon either faith or science, or to build a bogus science which will support your point of view regardless of actual evidence. And this is, of course, the tragedy of American creationism. I found this in the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale University. A girl, Kyla, had a tour of the museum, and someone explained to her about dinosaurs and the history of the Earth. And so she wrote a nice thank you message. Thank you for teaching us about dinosaurs. There was a flood, but it was not from the asteroid. We believe someone else. Now, American creationism is mostly a 20th century thing, but its cultural foundations were established in the 1600s. This idea that you cannot separate science and religion. Now, you know this, the geocentric universe of celestial spheres that underpin the common understanding of geological change on the Earth for quite a few centuries was crumbling. And on the other hand, though, the astronomical revolution of the 16th century was storing the celestial bodies in places just like the Earth. And once again, it was not a new thing. Even Plutarch, for example, who wrote in the 2nd century of the current era, he said that Aristotle and all of his garbage on celestial spheres is just nonsense, and the moon is made of elements like the Earth, maybe in different proportions, may well be inhabited. People like Leonardo da Vinci around 1500 knew Plutarch. It was popular in Florence. It was translated. And indeed, he used the arguments of optics, explaining that, I don't know much of Latin, but you can take from me. I painted Mona Lisa and other stuff. I know how bodies reflect light. And the moon does not reflect light the way a perfect sphere would do. It must be a round body, like the Earth. Well, this destroyed any possible doubt that remained. And in the course of the 1600s, really, the idea that the other planets, the moon and other planets, are bodies like the Earth, and usually inhabited, even by intelligent beings, became absolutely commonplace. 100%, just like today. So, for example, you can see here a very little-known page of Galileo's Starry Messenger. Sorry, this is wrong. This is actually from the Starry Messenger. No, from the dialogue on the two chief systems of the world.
It's like Galileo.
Yeah.
That's important.
No, you said that there used to be a different text. It was a letter from this chamber to Galileo. I changed it at the last moment because I decided this was better. And I forgot to change this thing. So it's not chamber to Galileo. February 1615, it is Galileo's dialogue on the chief systems of the world, 1632. And in this little known page, Galileo explained that, he realized that the environment of the moon must be different. If there is an atmosphere, it's really thin, but it's not a good reason to rule out the existence of forms of life very different from those on the Earth. I do not see that there cannot be things that do not change or are generated and dissolve. Things not only different from ours, but so far from our conceptions as to be entirely unimaginable by us. If you think that extraterrestrial life might have been a problem for the church, it was not. Okay, you went into trouble for this book, but not for this passage. In the following decades, the perception of the analogies between the Earth and the other bodies in the solar system was heavily reinforced by other telescopic observers, in particular by this Giovanni Domenico Cassini, an Italian who became, well, you know about Cassini's division in Saturn III, right? He was a wizard of telescopic astronomy. He became de facto the director of the Observatory of Paris, newly built in 1667. And while he was there, he produced a fantastic map of the moon. He was a great craftsman. Most astronomers there had a thorough training in drawing. He determined the rotation periods of Mars and Jupiter with very good accuracy, within a couple of minutes. That was a considerable achievement for the time. And he also believed that the moon, at least in certain places, could support at least a cycle of water and life similar to ours. In particular, these are drawing, one of a series of drawings that he made of crater Aristarchus here, and here Herodotus, and here Schroeder's Valley. I discovered that he actually discovered Schroeder's Valley. Not Schroeder, not even Huygens. But the most interesting thing about these drawings is that these comets is Aristarchus had a nebulosity stretching towards the nearby spot, Herodotus, and spread around Aristarchus itself and that spot. And well, you can see it's not a bad rendering. It is possible that one is fooled by this picture. Probably shows a similar elevation of the sun over the horizon as here. And of course, all of these albedo features will change a lot as the elevation of the sun changes. And so he thought that what happened was that vapors, rays or clouds raised from Aristarchus, and then it rained over Herodotus without monthly cycles. So the crater was cyclically filled with water and then drained. And given the means of the time, this was very reasonable inferences. It was wrong, of course, but sometimes celestial astronomy, astronomical images are really hard to interpret, and of course we think in terms of analogies with what we know. So in the late 1600s, these analogies had become pervasive, and they began to be used to draw comparisons between not only the present aspect of the Earth and of the other planets, but even their geological history. In 1681, there's Thomas Barnett, who was a clergyman, an Anglican clergyman, who later became the chaplain of the King of England, William III, published a book that is well known among historians of geology, and probably if you ever read a book on geology, there will be a box talking about this crazy book. So it was called The Sacred Theory of the Earth, and if you look at the frontispiece, we can read it together. This is basically the geological history of the Earth, framed and synchronized with the history of salvation. So we try to put together theology and geology in a way that no one had never done before. We have the understanding, the common perception that during the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, theology and science were kind of together and separated during the scientific revolution. And what happened was the opposite. Okay, this is the first time in the late 1600s when we had this kind of theories, this thing that we could call in 20th century America flood geology. It started there. And so what happens here, well, you can see the figure of Christ, I am the Alpha and the Omega, that dominates the geological history of the Earth. What happens is that here we have an initial chaos, and just proto-planetary matter that goes around, right? And then the Earth is formed, that at the beginning was pretty smooth, and it was really Eden. Eden was just a primeval Earth with an upright rotation axis, so it has an eternal spring, and very smooth all around. But then, because of the wickedness of humans and their fall, you need a universal flood that completely submerged the Earth, and when the water withdraws, you have a mangled body that is a world of ruins where we live now, which is much less fertile and much less hospitable than the primeval Earth, which is good because it sounds very Protestant to me and was raised Catholic. Now, you have to really toil and work hard to gain your salvation. So you cannot really stay in a comfortable world where you will become lazy, right? And then after a certain period of time will be the final conflagration, the return of Christ that will reign on the just, and so on. The part that is most interesting is this one, the four figures on the right. These images try to explain, they come from Barnett's work, what actually happened. There was no supernatural intervention, actually. His idea was that God creates the universe, and then the universe goes on and does its thing according to the laws of nature that God instituted. But at a certain point, God arranged things in a way that, for natural reasons, you will have a universal flood, you have the collapse of the primeval crust, so that the subterranean waters can emerge and inundate the whole of the Earth, which doesn't take much because it was perfectly smooth. But then when the waters withdraw, here you have mountains and valleys and the rugged surface that we have today. Now, he was not really a literalist. He thought that the 6 days of the creation in Genesis were just a metaphor. And they were there just to explain, inculcate in the primitive Hebrews of the time the idea that there was a creator God. And we still have a funny correspondence between him and Isaac Newton, who was much more of a literalist than him. And and so Barnett was trying to convince him that these 6 days of creation, don't mean anything really physical. But Newton was also convinced. He thought that there must be at least 6 stages of the creation. But he conceded that the first days of creation, at least before the creation of the sun and before you can actually have anything, reference system to measure time, could have been as long as you want. And so if you ever watched Inherit the Wind and the final exchange between the barrister and the biblical literalist, it's not like he had this stroke of genius. Hey, wait a moment, how can you measure a day if the sun has not been created yet? Okay, this argument had been discussed for at least 1,000 years. And you can find there in the correspondence between Newton and Barnett, and Newton concedes. However, his theory was largely speculative and couldn't find much evidence for all of his stuff on the Earth, and so he started looking at it in the skies, building on these strong analogies that had been built in the previous century between the Earth and the other planets, that according to Barnett should have been formed just like the Earth, right, and be quite smooth and regular bodies. So why is the surface of the moon like this? There is no reason why it is like this on the Earth. It is now acknowledged that the moon is a terraqueous globe consisting of mountains and valleys, as our Earth does. And you have no reason to believe but that she came into that form from like causes as our Earth did. So if you took a global flood to turn the Earth into a rugged body, it is now the same must have happened to the moon. And seeing all the planets that are placed in this heaven are the foster child of the sun, it seems probable that every one of them has suffered, or is to suffer, this deluge, as the Earth has done. These planets have intelligent beings in them. And what makes us intelligent is that we can see we can tell between good and evil, and unfortunately we tend to choose evil, at least from time to time. And so why shouldn't the same happen on the other planets? Barnett's work initiated a veritable literary genre, and there was a number of authors that in the following decades exposed different theories, and everyone really had their own theory of the Earth. It was a super popular thing, almost like trying to figure out the day of the Armageddon. I mean, I think that in a pub in England at the time, the late 1600s, you could find people betting on the day of the Armageddon. Oh, you're following that bet, theologians, I have a better one, it's not going to happen there, it's going to happen here, and so on. And everyone also had a theory of the Earth. Newton had one as well. He never published his one, but one of his pupils did, after the manuscript was revised and approved by Newton himself. So this was William Whiston, who was actually his successor on the occasion chair of mathematics at Cambridge, when Newton moved to the Mint in London. And he was the author of books with a self-explanatory title, like The Astronomical Principle of Religion, meaning Newtonian astronomy not only is compatible with the Christian revelation, but actually proves it with physical evidence. Actually, I mean, this gravity thing, Newton could determine its properties, but could not determine where it comes from. What is it? Is attraction that works at a distance, immaterial, unmaterial thing that can act upon bodies? He had no idea where it could come from. Why should a dumb rock attract another dumb rock? The only explanation here is that this must be God that instills in every second, every instant, gravity in the universe, in every particle of matter. Literally, Newton's universe cannot stand without continuous intervention of God in the creation, which Christians call providence. And so he also published a theory of the Earth that, unsurprisingly, was based on and used a lot Newtonian mechanics. So one of the problems with Barnett is that you need a lot of water to submerge the Earth, and this was one of the reasons why he thought that primeval Earth must be pretty smooth, right, and regular. So you don't need that much water to submerge it. You don't want to have mountains that are miles high. But Whiston thought that he had another and better solution. He thought that using the tools provided by Newtonian mechanics, he figured out that the Earth had a close encounter with a holy comet in the year, let me check, 2349 BCE on September 16. That was the closest approach. Well, you could do that now, right? We have the laws of gravity now. You can figure out the trajectory of comets. You can calculate their path. Maybe he was a little bit too confident. I would like to see his calculations, and not that confident, but anyone of you wants to, and let me know what you think. I would be very grateful. And this image, I mean, it's not perhaps too alien to you. Okay, we have two planetesimals, perhaps in a collision course on a very close encounter. The thing is that here, the big body is a comet. It was not known at the time that comets, while they are so immensely large, actually have a very small mass. It was not known yet. And so his idea was that these immense tails must be made of water vapor. And so when the Earth crossed the tail of the comet, the atmosphere absorbed a lot of this humidity, got soaked and discharged it on the ground. And that was what caused the universal flood. Again, a completely natural explanation, but God had preordained the universe so that it should happen at the right time. Of course, the Armageddon will also be brought by another comet, and maybe some of you are familiar with that. Looks like, the planetesimal that hit the Earth and then made the moon. Okay, this is different. Again, the big body is the comet, and this time it is on a collision course with the Earth, and this will be the Armageddon. Now, there is one thing that I wanted to cut for reasons of time, but I will leave it because it is too cool in my opinion. Oh, but he was a millenarian, just like Newton, so he thought that the end of time was close, uncomfortably close, actually. His calculations had the day of the Armageddon for October 16, 1736. This time I'm pretty sure that he did not reckon it right.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm a little rusty on my dates, but this is before Edmund Halley showed that his comet was a periodic comet, right?
Yeah.
So
that was later.
That was measured orbits. Yeah, they knew that they came around, and they did know that the comets were sort of orbited the sun and not things in the not vapors in the Earth.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Actually, that would be the theory that was mainstream until the late 1600s. That is that the comets, Aristotle thought that the comets are not celestial bodies but exhalation from the Earth that got ignited in the upper atmosphere, so to speak. And yes, this idea became superseded in the late 1600s. And actually, no, earlier. So the one that really destroyed was Tycho Brahe, because he built. Yale takes a lot of credit for instruments, but a few decades earlier, big science was Tycho Brahe, and he was able to improve the accuracy of Ptolemy's positional measurement by an order of magnitude. No one had done it since antiquity. That was a big deal. And so he could measure the parallax of the moon, but he could not measure the parallax of a comet. And so he said, no, comets must be in the skies. They must not be in the atmosphere. If they were in the atmosphere, I could measure their parallax. But of course, it takes a lot of time for these things to become mainstream and for everyone to become convinced of that. Yeah, but by the time, absolutely, it was Halley figured out that Halley. Oh, come on, how do you pronounce it? I want to know. Halley. Okay, Halley. So Halley figured out that it was the same comet, and it was an empirical thing. And then with Newton's law of gravity, you can figure out its orbit and reckon when to be back, and you can extend this to all the other comets as long as you have enough observations, as you know. And the cool thing that I was mentioning is that these ideas and this book found enthusiastic supporters in Puritan New England, in people like Cotton Mather, who was a very influential minister, the youngest person ever to be admitted at Harvard. He was not even 12. His father then became the 6th president of Harvard. And besides being an enthusiastic supporter of Newtonian astronomy, he had a big role in the Salem witch trials. So yes, he could believe in witchcraft, he could believe in invisible forces, he could believe in the action of the devil in the world, and be a big supporter of frontline science. They barely knew good science that existed at the time, and to him, this thing stayed perfectly well in his head. On the contrary, they supported each other. If gravity can act, an immaterial thing can act upon matter, why not souls? Why not spiritual entities? Gravity was used for like 1 century, more for apologetic reasons, to support the existence of spiritual entities and of the existence of God. And he followed wisdom in one of his most bizarre theories. So everything can be studied as can be studied as a physical body, but they also have a theological meaning. And with this theological meaning of comets, Wisdom and Cotton Mather as well thought that they were worlds that already had their Armageddon. And after that, they were placed on high elliptical orbits to serve as hells for their sinful inhabitants. And so now, he preached in his sermons, must be terrifying, when I see a vast comet, that's right, when I see a vast comet, blazing and rolling about the unmeasurable ether, I now see a wicked world, made a fiery oven in the time of the anger of God. The Lord swallowing them up in his wrath, and the fire devouring them. I'm sure his pronunciation was better, but well, he said, and so your comet now turned, your planet now turned into a comet is bringing his land close to the sun where they were roasted, and then in the other solar system where they will be frozen. Not to death, because unfortunately for them they cannot die anymore, and they have just to endure the pain. Now, not everyone bought this stuff, all right? And one of those who didn't was this Fontenelle, a Frenchman, who is the most important and influential astronomy popularizer ever. Forget about Carl Sagan and Cosmos. This Entretien sur la pluralité des mondes habités, the dialogues on the plurality of worlds, is the most successful book of astronomy popularization ever. He published it first in 1686. It was reprinted for more than 150 years, even when it was hopelessly outdated. Astronomically, they added notes explaining, oh, look, this theory is no longer good, this thing is wrong. But it kept it printing and read because one of the reasons was that it was considered a perfect manual of polite conversation. So it happens what happens is that there is a knight who entertains a charming marquise during summer nights, explaining to her the new universe of the new astronomy. And so basically it became kind of mandatory reading for every educated girl. So every educated girl was familiar with the existence of other worlds and that the worlds were inhabited, because this is what the book talks about. Okay, everyone believed it in the 1700s. He was one of those who were called libertines, not in the sense that they were womanizers or morally unethical, but in the sense that they were free thinkers. And he was one of those who were starting to undermine the belief in the divine origin of Scripture. And since they are so attached to the flood, well, let's show that you don't need at all a flood, and that a flood never existed. And if you cannot trust Genesis on such a big thing, an enormous upheaval of the whole globe, how can you trust it on anything else, right? That was the trap of living religion. And so he still needed, even though he did not believe in his universal flood, he still needed some mechanism to foster the geological evolution of the Earth, something that could bring fish on mountaintops where they petrified, they became fossils, and so on. And again, not finding anything really convincing on the Earth, he became very interested in the observations of Mars that Maraldi carried out in the early 1700s at the Observatory of Paris. This Fontenelle was the secretary of the Academy of Sciences in Paris. And so every year he wrote the memoirs of the Academy, where he discussed the observations and the papers of his colleagues. And so he talks a lot about the observations of Mars made by Maraldi. Okay, this is nothing particularly spectacular. I don't see that. They come directly from the Observing Journal. Maraldi observed Mars during the great oppositions of 1704 and 1719. As you know, Mars is really small for most of the times, but every 15 years his apparent diameter can grow to 33, 25 seconds, which means that even the instruments of the time could show some vague feature of the surface, like the polar caps and the main markings of the surface, and the main albedo markings. And I conducted this observation for a few weeks around the position, because they were the most favorable times. And what he saw puzzled him a lot, because he didn't seem to grasp any stable configurations. I mean, moonspots are pretty stable even with the naked eye. Leonardo da Vinci made a drawing of naked eye drawings of the moon with the spots. I made the same ones, and they were very comparable. I mean, they're there, they are still there. But he couldn't see anything stable on the surface of Mars. And Fontenelle got very interested in that. with hindsight, we know what was happening probably. He was observing when Mars was close to the perihelion for the stated reasons, but this is a sunstorm season on Mars. This is the season when we had big global sandstorms. Like this one. Even global sandstorms can erase the markings of the surface. If you have a regional one, probably this part will disappear, this part is still there, then you may have a big storm here, and this part instead will clear up, and so on. And if you observe with a telescope visually, and had some experience in doing that, they can really change the marking of the surface. Now, no one on the Earth has ever experienced a global sandstorm, fortunately. And certainly this was not in the mind of Fontenelle. What he was thinking of was geological events. He was thinking in terms of geology. He thought that this could be the Mars that Maraldi was observing could be a sort of magnetic world where there were gigantic geological upheavals that could change the surface in a matter of weeks. Interestingly, he thought that this may be an example of what could have happened on the Earth thousands of years ago. Maybe the Earth as well, at a certain point, was in this state of violent global geological activity. And so he wrote that considerable changes take place over the whole surface of Mars. In comparison, the surface of the Earth has been rather calm for a long time. Why this difference between bodies of the same nature? This would be a considerable difficulty, were it not resolved by the great and ancient revolutions that happened to our globe, as witnessed, of course, by the shells and fish buried in the soils and on mountains in every part of the world. So what he was thinking is that these great upheavals at a certain point might have brought parts of the sea bottom at an elevation, and they became mountains, and vice versa. And it so happens that such surprising revolutions, often regarded as philosophical dreams by common people, would not experience anything comparable, are in fact necessary. Now, this is a bit of a stretch, perhaps, but probably he knew that it was not really a demonstration that the same happened on the Earth, but he was trying to build plausibility for this idea. And we believe a lot of things just because they're very plausible. Right, I mean, the first hard evidence for the motion of the Earth was only obtained in 1799. No astronomers still believed that the Earth didn't move at the time, for decades. But the context around it was such that it didn't make any sense for the Earth not to move. So not a universal flood, but periods of this violent geological activity. And in fact, many of these dark patches sketched by Maraldi are still perfectly recognizable centuries later if you are familiar with the telescopic astronomy, telescopic aspect of Mars. So we have the patch called by Schiaparelli Syrtis Major. This would be the Erythraean Sea. And this elbow is the junction between, I think, the Cimmerian and the Cimmerian Sea and Sea of Mermaid. This one doesn't make any sense, and this is probably a region of the planet that was undergoing some dust storm. But many of these markings are still recognizable centuries later. But Maraldi agreed with Fontenelle that this must be transitory features, and so he didn't bother to make a map. He could have made the first map of Mars, crude, but still useful. He didn't. The fact that he didn't is still useful, because we know that there were global sandstorms, or almost global sandstorms, in 1719 on Mars, and actually there is a book that collects all of the sandstorms, big sandstorms of Mars, and then it starts from there. And again, the supporters of the flood counterattacked, looking instead for stable worlds. And here enters a guy who's actually a good friend of Maraldi, an Italian called Francesco Bianchini, who was an astronomer, an antiquarian, archaeologist, an historian, and so on, who spent about 40 years in Rome serving as a sort of scientific and cultural advisor to various popes, and working behind the curtain to try to mend the rip between the Catholic Church and modern science caused by Galileo's trial. So when Galileo's dialogue was removed from the list of the forbidden books in 1730, he should have part of the credit because it worked hard for this to become possible behind the scenes and with great diplomatic skills that you need to have in that part of the world at the time. He was certainly a Copernican, but he didn't buy into the geological antiquity of the Earth. He didn't think that there is any documentary evidence or geological evidence being demonstrating this antiquity. And he tended to think that the Earth really was just a few thousand years old, probably. And if you think so, then you really need this big flood in order to explain, as a mechanism, to explain its surface. And so he has the keen interest in geology. This is from his notebooks. It is a study of Mount Vesuvius that he did while he was on a trip to Naples in 1702. This is the current view from Google Earth, from more or less the same viewpoint. As you can see, the volcano is now different, which is fine because there has been a lot of volcanic activity in the meantime. And this is the kind of changes on the surface that indeed he expected. Local modifications, not great global upheavals, apart from this great universal flood. Actually, he was one of the first to give a try to absolute dating of Earth's strata. This started in the late 1600s to demonstrate that the Bible was literally right. And now this doesn't make any sense for a modern geologist. Of course, strata, the study of strata will show that the Earth is very old. But at the time, the ones who started studying strata and really pushed to work on fossils were trying to use this evidence to demonstrate that the Bible was right. And so this is another view of Mount Vesuvius. He was observing from here. This is the other side. Here is Pompeii, the city that was Roman city, famously buried by an eruption in the year 79 of the current era. And one day he got a little relation of digs that happened in Pompeii. And these digs revealed an alternance of sedimentary and volcanic layers. And so, since the place had been inhabited for thousands of years, he could use historical documents and records in order to date the volcanic layers that corresponded, in his opinion, to the great eruptions, starting from the recent one in 1631, and then going down backwards in time until the one that destroyed Pompeii. And since these ones were kind of regular, happened at regular intervals, he thought that it was the same even before, which is not true, but it was a very reasonable assumption. Until they found, guess what? A gigantic layer of limestone, exactly where you'd expect to find the Great Flood. You can see the evidence very different ways. Okay, with better evidence, you can find that this was not really correct, but it was good. I mean, for the time, it was good. It was really good. And it was almost unprecedented. This had been done for maybe 20 years, even less. He published this thing in 1696. And it's not a coincidence that Newton returned to planetary astronomy around 1713, after he returned from a diplomatic trip where he met with Newton, and he also met with Maraldi and Fontenelle, with whom he diplomatically disagreed. And when he came back, he began to use their own weapons to show that their evidence were not really consistent. And so he started looking for stability in the planetary worlds. And he has magnificent patrons, we call them donors. And so he could use the best lenses of the time, and really he proved to be really good at it. So this region of the moon, it is the first depiction to show what we call now Valles Alpes in the moon. It is not present even in the map of the moon by Cassini. I haven't seen it even in his drawings. This is another study of Aristarchus. He knew that Cassini had found that evidence of a cycle of water, And these two drawings of Mars are actually much more accurate than those of Morali's. And you can see, if you use a Schiaparelli's map in this case, this is the first ever depiction of this region Hesperia between the Cimmerian Sea and the Tyrrhenian Sea in Schiaparelli's nomenclature of Mars. These are the best depiction of these details up to that time. And so after a while, he felt confident that he could turn his telescopes to a very difficult objects like Venus, but it had an advantage. You can observe it comfortably, continuously, rather than just every 15 years or 17 years, like is the case of Mars. And so you can have a good picture of its rotation period and evolution over a long time. And he published a book on the topic in 1728 called The New Phenomena of Hesperus and Phosphorus. And this book is especially interesting because I found that a lot of the manuscripts that he used to make this book and the observations are still around. And so we can go from the telescopic sketch, the rough sketch that he made of the telescope, to the watercolors that he made to give a realistic rendition of what Venus looked like at a telescope. And if you have experience with the telescopic aspect of Venus, this is very good. This is a very good rendition. This is more or less what you can see. It is very plausible. And then to the studies that he did to see how these patches evolved. He was trying to figure out the rotation period of Venus, and finally the final result. And so you can see that made choices. These are supposedly two images from the same day. Now, to think that it was cheating with the data, in my opinion, would be a bit unfair, and in this case, the onus of the burden of proof should fall on the historian. What was happening is that he was comparing drawings from same days, or even from different days, or from different observing seasons, and the details of Venus are always very fuzzy and difficult to determine, and so he was trying to average them in a way. And sometimes there are observations that didn't use in the book, others in the book that are not in the manuscript, they probably got lost, and so on. But the fact is, he decided to see stability. He decided that while Maraldi or Fontenelle could have easily decided that there was nothing fixed on the surface of Venus, instead he made a map. He decided that these are actually features of the ground and not some quickly evolving geological situation on the planet. The key's analysis was guided by the fundamental idea of the stability of planetary worlds. Now, if you're left with the impression that many of these theories and observations have presented range from the unprofessional to sheer madness, this is perfectly understandable, yet I think it would be also unwarranted. These people were neither insane nor devoid of observing powers or incapable of proper reasoning, but they started from very different assumptions, pursued their investigations with different aims in mind, and tried to answer different questions. And this means that given the same evidence that we would see, they read it and arranged it in a very different way than we would. And while historical distance makes their biases and erroneous assumptions stand out, it doesn't mean that we don't have our own, and that we will stand out in a few centuries or probably even decades. And they're just as feasible to us, simply because we are immersed into them. And besides, their same criteria for what constituted reliable evidence might have been very different, because they were also affected by the social structures and the social conventions of the time. And I want to show you an example of this. At a certain point, Bianchini really wanted to make an observation that would be considered reliable and credited, and then no one would question. Good. I took the observation of, I think, February 16, 1726. Now, if we read his account of that observing session, it sounds like a farce. One may argue that we were not making science, that was a social gathering, a social event, the kind of things that we do for a fundraiser. Of all possible places he mounted his 20-meter long telescope in the garden of Barberini Palace, an imposing aristocratic residence in Rome. The garden is behind. And they started observing soon after sunset. It was spring, there was a spring elongation, so Venus was very high, and they had about 3 hours of time to observe the planet. The palace was even too imposing. At a certain point, Venus fell behind the building. And so the astronomer disassembled the telescope, which was 20 meters long, because they still use simple lenses. And the only way they could have decent images was by having an incredibly long focal length, right? And he reassembled the telescope in one of the big salons of the palace, and you see that there are these big windows, and they happen to point westward. And so they could conclude the observation there. And the witnesses included no professional astronomers. However, there was a small crowd of cardinals, courtiers, aristocratic patrons, who took a look. And they all testified that the planet appeared exactly as Bianchini depicted it. And you can bet there were servants and valets serving refreshments and delicacies. Now, later historians judged harshly this observation as unprofessional. But the problem is that his critics no longer understood the social context of his time. Bianchini did exactly what one was supposed to do to strengthen the credibility of an experiment or of an observation. And by and large, the scientific knowledge at the time was not created and validated within a small group of specialists like today. And the astronomical community, so to speak, included a very small number of what would look like professional astronomers, but mostly it was made by educated people of sufficiently high social standing with an interest in science that didn't have to make a paycheck out of astronomy. And in the aristocratic culture of the time, this made them impartial witnesses. Now, how can you be impartial if you make money out of what you're doing? Yeah, vested interests, right? You should be an aristocratic, you don't work. You live off your rent, as a free man should. Okay, and now you can be an impartial witness of experiments and observations. And so this was a perfect place, and these were the perfect people, important people that no one would dare be lying. If you want a more famous example, take Galileo's dialogue on the chief systems of the world. This is, indeed, a courtly dialogue. It is a courtly conversation. It takes place in a court among 3 amateurs, which at the time had a positive meaning. It means people that instead of just drinking and eating and enjoying their money, do something useful. And get involved in science and try to advance human knowledge. But they are amateurs. And it was written in Italian, not because he was democratic who wanted to democratize science. We like to believe that, but it doesn't make any sense. Okay, let's face it. It was written in Italian, in a literary and sophisticated Italian, because that was the language of the courts. Not Latin, that was the language of the church and of the universities. In the court, you speak this refined and literary Italian, which he used in his book, because that was his audience. And so he doesn't use any mathematics that an 8th grader could not understand, because he is talking not to specialists, but to generally educated people that are supposed to be involved in the production of scientific knowledge. He's not doing popularization. Okay? He is proposing frontline science. Now, the transformation of scientific research into the highly specialized and highly institutional, painfully obvious in recent years. Right? I don't have a solution, but I hope that looking back at our past, we might gain a better understanding of where we are now and why. And I've never done it before, but today I would like to dedicate this lecture to a Greek historian of science, John Hybron, with whom we discussed a lot the work of Francesco Bianchini. He published a book on him at the age of 87, excellent book full of wit and ambition. 2 years ago, I had the honor to refer it for the publisher because there were 2 people who know that guy. It was me and him. But he knew it much better, so I told him, you should write a book because this guy is interesting, but it's complex. And you're much smarter than me. And so he passed 2 days ago while he was doing research for his next book. And I do not think that without his mentoring and friendship and support, I would be here today. Thank you.
Time for questions. I was so we met years ago as members of the UAI, right? The ratio between professional and non-professional astronomers.
Okay. So yeah, he was when he was a professor of mathematics at Padua University. It was not a very prestigious chair, right? And he had to deal with students at the time, and it was a bit annoying. And then he invents a telescope and writes the Starry Messenger. And what does it do? He dedicates the new star that he discovered around Jupiter, the Medicean satellites of Jupiter, to the reigning family in Florence, indeed the Medicis. And it was kind of like, okay, what do I get if I dedicate to you the only new celestial bodies ever discovered since the beginning of time, more or less? How about you become the first mathematician of the Grand Duke of Tuscany? Mathematician and philosopher? Okay, mathematician and philosopher. Sounds bad. And so he lives his crappy job as a university professor, and he becomes a courtier. He was a courtier, right? And as a courtier, he was the scientific astronomical consultant for the Grand Duke of Florence, and basically, really, what he did was to give prestige to his court. Was he a professional astronomer? Was he paid to do research? No. He did it for the fun of it. And you can have other samples. Was this Bianchini a professional astronomer? They did top-notch observations. I mean, as you know, I've been an amateur astronomer, and I always lived there for all of my life for some reasons. Every time I changed, I went to a new home, I always had a street light like this in the backyard, always. All right. And so I like to do planets because they are the only thing that I can see. They're bright enough. Okay, and these are very good renderings of Venus, which is very difficult. This is very good, and considering the instruments that he had, these drawings of Mars, details of Mars are amazing. And now this is an idea. Okay, this is an idealized observation. Of course, a telescope like this would not exist. But the focal length was in these steps. They just didn't have a tube. They had a big lens up there, maybe on a mast, and then someone was with the eyepiece in their hands with a rope connecting it to the lens that with the right focal distance. But if you think at the focal ratio, they were very permissive instruments. With a gigantic eyepiece, the eyepieces were like this. You could observe like that. And but was he a professional astronomer? Oh, he was not. No, he was a courtier at Rome. He was employed at the service of the Pope, and he did whatever he had to do. The archaeologist, the historian, and I've shown you his analysis of those geological digs. Now, if you think that he was a bad scholar because he was not specialized, now at the time, how can you determine and do geology and do an absolute stratigraphy if you are not an historian and archaeologist? He determined the age, the epoch of one of the sedimentary layers because there were archaeological manuscripts there, and he dated them at the late Republican age. Probably there were coins or things like this. Okay, and so the volcanic layer immediately above must have been that of the eruption of the Vesuvius in '79, in the early period. So I mean, being a polymath was not a bug for them. It was an asset. To others, it's a big bug. You cannot be good at everything, right? But they thought that they needed this wide perspective. Who was a professional astronomer? Maybe Cassini. His descendants, as a good Italian, when he was hired as de facto director of the Observatory of Paris, he brought the whole family, including the extended family. That Marali was a nephew. And we always had a Cassini at the head of the observatory until the French Revolution. The last one was Cassini IV. And they were professional astronomers, they were paid. Okay, but I mean, in the whole Europe, you could count them on one hand, probably, on your fingers. There were astronomers in London, there were astronomers in Paris, the astronomers of the Academy of Sciences in Berlin, a few more, and that was it. This McKinney was not an astronomer, not a professional astronomer according to our standards. And the professionalization of standards, the institutionalization of science, is something that started in the late 1700s. And the situation we have here with these universities turned into research centers and also education and higher education centers was basically defined in Germany in the 1800s. And that's the model that we have followed since.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this idea that this pushing science and religion together and making it a consistent thing was a new phenomenon and not medieval, as of course we all believe. So that's fascinating. But why did they explain why they felt they had to do that? Which in the end was a bad choice.
Yeah, I've written a book on the topic, but I will spare it to you. And I think we can summarize it. And it is a bit complicated. So one reason is that in the early 1500s, you start to see a certain rejection in certain environments of what was a pagan science, right? So I've seen them. You go to the library, you go to the rare book collection, pull out what would be a book for university students written in 1400s. The example that I give of what would a university student learn, okay, is real. Okay, and you have this book explaining all this stuff. You don't have one single reference to the creation, to God, nothing. Absolutely nothing. This is basically Aristotelian science, modernized and elaborated with a lot of help from the Arabs and a lot of recent elaborations in Europe. And it is completely independent from theology. And theologians were fine with that. As long as you stay clear of a religion. So, for example, it is okay to say that I don't see any evidence of the universal flood. Okay, and so we don't talk about it because we think that maybe it was just a miracle. And so if there's a miracle, it's out of the scope of science, right? Science is science, religion is religion. It's not like explain miracles with science. By definition, the miracle is supernatural, right? So it's not my business, and I talk about it. And so this book wouldn't even mention that there was a universal flood. Sometimes you find a one-liner saying to the student, oh, by the way, yeah, there was this massive universal flood. But it was a miracle, so it's not our business. But it was completely transparent. It's not like I cannot explain how it happened, but it happened, and so we must have now fossils of great geological evidence for it. No. I mean, it was completely transparent until the early 1500s. What happened was a reaction which was perceived as a really pagan science, and it was. Because these guys, without any problem, the world is eternal. Because this is what Aristotle thought. And so God, created. Oh no, I'm speaking as a natural philosopher, right? If I think as a natural philosopher, then I cannot see any evidence of a creation. And I see these cyclical geological revolutions, and that's about it. I don't see any creation. If you theologian tell me that there was a creation, I'm fine, but I cannot see the evidence. And by the way, this creation must have been supernatural, right? So again, not my business. And theologians were fine with it for the reason that you have seen. Because the moment that you want to prove the literal truth of Genesis with physical evidence, you can have a lot of enthusiasm and think that you can do it, and that it is absolutely true. The first Delugeist was the founder of modern stratigraphy, Nicholas Stensen, a Danish who published is basically what are the principles of how to interpret geological strata in the late 1600s, in 1668. And he did so because he wanted to show that the geological appearance of the Earth can be explained through a universal flood in historical times. And he is the founder of modern stratigraphy. He's considered the father of modern stratigraphy. But when these big guys cannot find this evidence, or this evidence is dubious or inconclusive, what do you do now? And the medieval theologians and natural philosophers were keenly aware of this problem, and so they kept theology and natural philosophy completely separate. And this conflation happened mostly, even before, but mostly with the Protestant Reformation that was driven by a strong biblical literalism, much stronger than the people that were in Rome. The popes of the time really were big sinners, honestly, and excellent humanists and very learned people, and some of them, it is arguable whether they were Christians or not. But Luther, certainly, Martin Luther certainly was, and in the Protestant universities that were founded, they started elaborating a natural philosophy of nature, a science that was more Christian. And you see a Christianization of and a confessionalization of physics, of earth history, of astronomy, and as a reaction, there's study happening even in Catholic countries. The first book that I've seen that tries to squeeze the traditional earth history within the frame of the Christian chronology, the 6,000 years of the earth, was published in 1570, more or less. And until 1600, there was almost no one who will tell you that the fossil fish mountains are there because of the Pacific flood. There were alternative explanations. Well, a great supporter of the idea was Martin Luther, but he was not a quotable authority for a Catholic. And so there was this big radicalization and this big rise of literalism. And you can see, as I showed in astronomy, everyone knows about it, right? Okay, so Copernicus published his book in 1543. Okay, same year when they framed this fish. Same year when they framed this fossil fish. 1543. And I mean, he is working as the accountant for a cathedral. He's employed as a bishop. And he dedicates the book to the Pope. Okay, and no one has a problem with that. Okay, the problems start mounting in the late 1500s. And it is at the same time, about 1570, when Jesuit astronomers start using scriptural arguments in books about astronomy. And no one did it. No one did. You can find natural philosophers in the Middle Ages, in the 1300s, discussing the spinning of the Earth. Yeah, they had this problem. Okay, the sky is pretty big, and if it turns around the Earth one every 24 hours, well, the speed, the tangential speed must be pretty high. I don't know if up there, which was millions of miles, I know it was at least millions of miles, so you have material that can resist the centripetal force. Well, it is the fifth element. It can do everything by definition. Okay, but many were not that convinced, and so a guy who was actually the most famous natural philosopher in the year of France, and he was the rector of the University of Paris, wrote these questions on Aristotle's physics, and he said, well, we have no real evidence of whether the Earth spins or the skies. I mean, relativity was already fake. Okay. However, the Earth is much more than the skies, and so it's much easier to move a small body. So in my opinion, it is more likely that the Earth spins. They thought in terms of likelihood in many cases when they didn't have hard evidence. And I mean, he was himself an enthusiastic. No one had a problem with it. And then in 1616, this big mess happens when the Copernicanism is condemned, and then 20 years later you have the trial of Galileo. And honestly, no serious historical science think that it was about a titanic collision between faith and reason. It was because Galileo made a big mistake, and he really, if I may use the term, I'm sorry, but this is the best term that I can think now, so forgive me being a foreigner, he really pissed off the Pope. Because the Pope gave him permission to write a book on the system of the worlds where he could discuss Copernicanism. And there were a couple of conditions, very reasonable. The Pope was also a personal friend of Galileo. He was also from Florence. And they said, okay, in the book, you must write this thing. You have to deal with every system of the world in a balanced way, which was fine because not everyone was sold on the motion of the Earth yet. Right, and then you have to write that whatever our models, we may never be able to discover the system of the world, because astronomy is, that was a good idea. Astronomy was not about the physical study of the skies. It is about building models of planetary motions, mathematical models of planetary motion. This is what Ptolemy and Copernicus are about. Okay, and so, I mean, you can change different models, and maybe one of them is true, but we may never be able to figure out how really God engineered the universe. And so, Galileo did, and he put these words in the mouth of Simplicius, the Aristotelian philosopher, at the end of the book, who for 400 pages has made a fool of himself. And this is probably the real reason why the Pope got really upset and said, I'm done with you. They made a lot of enemies, always protected you, now you are on our own. So, I mean, things were a bit complicated. More complicated than we have thought for a long time, honestly.
Yeah, we should probably continue the conversation over coffee, and let's thank our speaker again.
C'è una traduzione invece che è quasi introvabile. Cioè avevano l'osservatorio, l'osservatorio a Parigi, è discreta, però c'è una traduzione in inglese. E se mi lascia un numero di telefono, un'email, so io lo trovo. Oh, sorry. And, dunque era la biblioteca, una nostra parte della biblioteca culturale di Roma, per cui di Roma, e alla sua morte.